And that's what rock and roll is all about, that edge, the peak, the thing. And this song's about rock and roll.
Neil Young never pursued technical perfection in his music. Instead, he searched for something more elusive and valuable: authenticity. While countless musicians spent years refining their technique until every note sparkled with precision, Young deliberately preserved the rough edges. He understood that the imperfections, the unexpected cracks and raw moments were where real emotion lived. His guitar playing often seemed to wander without a clear destination, like someone searching for answers in the dark. His singing voice broke and strained in ways that would make a vocal coach wince. But these weren't flaws to Young, they were features. He wasn't interested in creating something polished and safe. He wanted to capture genuine feeling, and he found his inspiration in records that disturbed him, moved him deeply, and refused to compromise their truth for commercial appeal. The albums Young loved most weren't comfortable listening experiences. They were recordings that revealed their creators' vulnerabilities, works that wore their damage openly rather than hiding behind studio tricks and multiple takes. He treasured these records the way someone might value scars, as evidence that beauty and brokenness could exist together in the same space. These albums taught Young fundamental lessons about artistry. They showed him that so-called mistakes could be sacred, that the process of searching mattered more than reaching any final destination, and that one honest, imperfect note carried more weight than 1,000 technically flawless ones. Behind every distorted guitar solo drenched in feedback and every vulnerable whispered lyric in Young's catalog lived these 7 influential albums. They demonstrated how to approach music fearlessly, how to break conventions that deserved breaking, and how to trust your instincts even when the entire world questioned your judgment. The first album that changed Young's understanding of music was a collection of Hank Williams's greatest hits. When Young heard Williams sing, he encountered loneliness expressed in a way he'd never experienced before. Williams's voice carried an emotional weight that had nothing to do with volume or technical prowess. He sang about heartbreak as if he'd personally discovered the concept, about drinking to forget, about leaving and being left, about trains carrying people to nowhere in particular. Young, growing up in Canada surrounded by folk music traditions, heard something ancient and primal in Williams's songs. It was something that predated rock and roll, something fundamentally true before truth even had a recognizable sound in popular music. Songs like "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry" required no explanation or interpretation. The emotion hit you immediately and physically. Your Cheatin' Heart told a story that everyone understood on some level, even if they didn't want to acknowledge it. Williams sang in the plainest, simplest way possible, but there was a crack in his voice that made every word believable. Young learned from this that you didn't need to dress up pain in elaborate metaphors or complex arrangements. You could say it directly and let the rawness do the work. What truly devastated Young about Williams's music was the unfiltered honesty. There were no clever metaphors to hide behind, no studio production to polish away the rough edges. Just a man with a guitar expressing feelings too overwhelming to keep inside. Williams died tragically young at 29, consumed by the life he sang about, but his songs achieved a kind of immortality because they spoke truth without compromise. Young carried this lesson throughout his entire career. Don't make it pretty. Don't smooth away the imperfections. Let people hear where your voice breaks. The second transformative album was Bob Dylan's The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. When Young heard this record, he realized that words in songs could function as weapons, that lyrics could challenge and provoke rather than simply entertain. Released in the early 1960s, the album sounded unlike anything else in popular music. Dylan sang as if he was completely unconcerned with whether listeners liked his voice. It was sharp, nasal, and entirely distinctive. He wrote songs that posed difficult questions without waiting around for comfortable answers. Young was still a teenager playing in bands around Canada, but this album revealed that music could matter beyond getting people to dance. Songs like Blowin' in the Wind asked questions that society wanted to avoid. A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall painted apocalyptic imagery using poetic language that felt both timeless and urgent. Don't Think Twice, It's Alright walked away from a failed relationship without sentimentality or second-guessing. Dylan didn't sing to sound pleasant. He sang because the songs demanded to exist. Young heard this and recognized he'd found a teacher, someone who proved you didn't need a conventionally beautiful voice to communicate something important. What impacted Young most profoundly was Dylan's courage. He stood alone with an acoustic guitar and challenged everything around him. The folk music scene wanted straightforward protest songs with clear messages. Dylan gave them complexity and ambiguity. The world wanted simple answers and reassurance. Dylan gave them more questions and uncertainty. He showed no interest in pleasing anyone. His only concern was expressing truth as he understood it. The third album that shaped Young's artist vision was the Beatles' Rubber Soul. Released in the mid-60s, this record captured the band in transition, caught between being screaming teen idols and serious artists hungry to explore new territory. They weren't boys anymore on this album. They were becoming searchers, musicians willing to risk their massive success to pursue something more meaningful. Songs like Norwegian Wood twisted folk music conventions into something strange and Eastern-influenced. In My Life looked backward with mature perspective. Nowhere Man questioned the values that pop culture typically celebrated. Young heard them evolving in real time and paid close attention. The Beatles on Rubber Soul sounded uncertain in the most productive way possible. They weren't lost, but they were definitely exploring unmapped territory. Acoustic guitars blended with sitars. Love songs admitted doubt and confusion. The harmonies remained beautiful, but now they carried psychological weight. Young loved that they refused to play it safe. They had conquered the world and could have coasted on their success, but instead they chose to risk everything chasing something more authentic. What Young admired most was their willingness to experiment without knowing where the experiments might lead. The Beatles could have repeated their early formula forever and become wealthy beyond measure. Instead, they pushed boundaries constantly. They asked what if and followed their curiosity into the unknown. Rubber Soul proved that commercial success and artistic growth didn't have to contradict each other.
The fourth influential album was the Rolling Stones' Aftermath. When Young heard this record, he felt genuine danger radiating from the speakers. Released in the mid-60s, this captured the Stones at their hungriest moment, before fame became overwhelming, before substances took their toll. This was raw rock and roll with blues running through its veins and anger in its throat. Paint It Black sounded like witnessing the world's ending. Under My Thumb swaggered with disturbing power. Goin' Home jammed for 11 minutes when radio stations wanted 3-minute songs. The Stones didn't care about commercial considerations, and Young noticed this attitude. What struck Young was their commitment to existing on the edge of acceptability. They weren't trying to be likable or safe. They were trying to be real at any cost. Keith Richards' guitar playing snarled and bit. Mick Jagger sang like someone who'd seen too much darkness but wanted more anyway. Brian Jones added unexpected colors through unusual instruments like sitar and dulcimer, making rock and roll strange and beautiful simultaneously. Young loved this combination of danger and experimentation living together. The Stones, on Aftermath, took risks that could have failed spectacularly, but they committed completely without safety nets or compromises. The fifth album was Phil Ochs's I Ain't Marching Anymore. This record broke Young's heart in important ways. Released in the mid-60s, it represented protest music that actually protested rather than politely suggesting change. Oakes sang about war, racism, and hypocrisy with a voice shaking with conviction. Young heard this fire and recognized emotions he'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. Oakes showed him that folk music could hit as hard as rock and roll. The title track refused to fight in pointless wars. Draft Dodger Rag mocked blind patriotism. Links in the Chain connected all struggles for freedom into one unified fight. Oakes didn't hint at his political beliefs, he declared them boldly. Young admired this directness immensely. The world in the mid-60s was tearing itself apart over Vietnam and civil rights. Oakes picked a side and sang about it without apology. The sixth album was Jimi Hendrix's Electric Ladyland. This record freed Young's understanding of what guitars could accomplish. Released in the late 60s, it exploded every existing rule about guitar playing. Hendrix didn't just play his instrument, he channeled electricity itself, making his guitar scream, weep, whisper, and roar, sometimes within the same song. Young heard these sounds and realized he'd been holding himself back. The guitar wasn't meant to be controlled and tamed, it was meant to be unleashed and allowed to speak. Voodoo Child's slight return sounded like the earth splitting open. All Along the Watchtower took Dylan's words and set them ablaze. Hendrix used the recording studio as an instrument itself. Feedback wasn't a mistake to be avoided, it was music. Distortion wasn't noise to be eliminated, it was a form of conversation. What changed Young forever was Hendrix's freedom from convention. He didn't care about playing correctly according to any standard. He cared about playing honestly, following the sound wherever it led. Sometimes that meant beautiful melodies, sometimes that meant controlled chaos. Hendrix trusted himself completely and followed his instincts. Young absorbed this lesson and applied it throughout his career. Every extended jam session with Crazy Horse, every distorted solo that seemed to go nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, every moment he chose rawness over refinement could be traced back to permission Hendrix granted. The seventh and final album was Buffalo Springfield's self-titled debut, Young's own band's first record. He chose this not from ego but from truth. Released in the mid-60s, it captured something Young would spend his entire career trying to recapture. That magical moment when 5 musicians found something special before fame complicated everything, before success pulled them in different directions, before they fully understood what they were becoming. Just young men playing music that mattered to them personally, nothing more and nothing less. For What It's Worth became an anthem everyone knew, but the deeper album tracks affected Young more powerfully. Burned showed his voice finding itself. Leaving Flying on the Ground Is Wrong proved Richie Furay could break hearts. Leave let Young's guitar rage on record for the first time. The album was messy and uneven, but completely alive. Young loved it precisely for those flaws, because they proved it was real, made by humans rather than machines. What made this album sacred to Young was what it represented beyond the music itself: pure possibility. 5 young people from different backgrounds finding each other and creating something new by mixing folk, rock, country, and chaos into a sound that belonged to them alone. They didn't really know what they were doing, they just knew they had to do it. That innocence, that hunger, that precious moment before everything changed and became complicated by success and expectations, Young never stopped trying to capture it again in his subsequent work. These 7 albums taught Neil Young his most important lessons about music and artistry. They showed him to trust the noise, embrace the mistakes that make music human, and never polish away the truth in pursuit of commercial perfection. His guitar wails and cries the way it does because these records taught it how to speak. They demonstrated that searching matters more than finding, that the journey beats any destination, and that staying hungry, uncertain, and true to yourself matters more than any technical achievement. Neil Young never stopped searching, and these 7 albums gave him the map he needed, not to reach a final destination, but to keep exploring forever.